Hi, everyone, and welcome back to episode 4 with Wolfgang Palaver as we continue to discuss mimetic theory. And we are at the stage, the third stage in the mimetic insight, which is revealed religions as opposed to, I guess, early religions. And we've just talked about myth. And one of the important things to discuss that mimetic theory helps me understand is the difference between the Bible and ancient myths. So we just talked in the last episode about how myths tend to silence the violence that happens at during in those myths, and a lot of people say criticize the Bible for being so violent. The violence in the Bible is kind of set before us in a way that makes me and others uncomfortable, and atheists who criticize the Bible a lot uncomfortable too. So they see it as a reason that we should just do away with the Bible, all the violence within it. And so, what is the difference, Wolfgang, between the Bible and myth, and what do we do with the violence within the Bible?
That's again a question that would need a whole book.
Can you do
But
that in about two
let me,
minutes?
yeah, but let me try to start not with the difference. Let me try to start with the similarity between myth and the Bible, because Shura himself struggled for a very long time to respond exactly to your question in a concise and clear and plausible and not too complicated way. And the most important insight he gained, interestingly, from a severe and harsh critique of religion and especially Christianity from Friedrich Nietzsche. Friedrich Nietzsche, whom Girard labeled as the most important theologian of the 19th century, because Nietzsche clearly understood that what some of the religious studies scholars in the 19th century discovered, that many elements we find in myth is also in the biblical texts. And they started to say, well, the claim of the churches that the myths are just fairy tales and the Bible is true is just wrong. It's completely wrong. And Nietzsche also understands that the structure of those texts is very similar. In many of those texts, in myths, like in the Bible, we find the persecution of single individuals. We find martyrdom, we find perpetration. And Nietzsche understood the difference. And so Nietzsche saw the difference is not that in one text there is persecution and the other not. The difference is on what is, with whom that is the text siding. The myth just says, well, violence and persecution is part of human life. We have to go through it. We have to deal with it. But this is the way of life. Whereas the biblical texts emphasize the innocent of the persecuted victims. And this is a very important insight. So we have in many of those texts collective persecution of single individuals or minorities. But in the mythological texts in early religion, the persecution of victims is justified. Whereas in the Bible, you have many, many texts where this persecution of single individuals or minorities is harshly criticized by siding with those innocent scapegoats and persecuted scapegoats. And so you have at the same time similarity and difference. And the difference between Nietzsche and Girard is that Nietzsche sided with the old pagan myth over against the Bible, whereas Girard, like more or less the modern world, directly or indirectly, of course, understood that we are not allowed and justified to persecute single individuals. So our emphasis on human rights, or our emphasis to overcome persecution, I think is closely connected to this spirit of revealed religions, of this spirit of siding with persecuted victims. So that's the first thing. So in order to understand really the difference, you have to highlight the similarity, because if you do not address the similarity, then the whole thing has no connection. Then the Bible would really prevent Hollywood-style, nice, rosy success story, or a story to have good feelings, but not really related to the struggles and troubles of real life. And that leads to your second question: why is there so much violence in the texts described in the Bible? And Girard's thesis, which is, I think, again, a quite plausible and justifiable thesis, is that the Bible addresses the violence of persecution that happens among human beings and brings it out into the open. So I like one of his metaphors and one of his illustrations very much. He said, the myth who, after the scapegoat mechanism happened, puts more and more emphasis on the positive transference of the peace that came out of the scapegoat mechanism, is like a fur. You know, the nice side of a fur. Yep. Where it's smooth and nice, and you don't see the bloody side of the skin of the animal, skin. But the Bible, by siding with the victims, cries out the unjustified persecution and violence out into the world. So it shows you the bloody side of the violence that the myth covers up. Therefore, it's not a justification of violence. It's bringing violence out into the open in order that we can understand what happened in persecutions of people. So it doesn't cover up the violence. Yeah.
This is a pretty counterintuitive way of thinking about the Bible, or at least countercultural way of dealing with the Bible, because it seems that as a Protestant, a lot of the questions that I get about the Bible are questions like, well, the God of the Old Testament is just a violent God. It's this kind of Marcion Knight view of the Bible. The God of the Old Testament is a violent God, and the God of Jesus is a nice, loving God. And so many problems with that I'd like to talk through with you, including anti-Semitism of an idea like that. And how does mimetic theory help us deal with that issue?
I think a good example to address that question is the prevented sacrifice of Isaac by his father Abraham. I mean, I also know church-going people who are really, whenever this passage is read in the church, are completely confused and puzzled and said, I mean, how can a God demand from his father to kill his own son? Yeah. And I think the problem with such a passage is that we read it with modern eyes, with our modern understanding. And if we read this text with a modern understanding, it's really outrageous, and the new atheists are justified to say this text, the Bible, all those things should be prohibited all over the world. But the important thing is to read these texts from the perspective of the emergence of these two types of religion we talked about before. So if you understand the early sacred, the sacred as it emerged in the beginning of human civilization, it was highly likable that a father would sacrifice his firstborn son. So sacrifices of firstborn sons, firstborn animals are a pattern that we can find in many cultures, and sometimes even still going on today. So we have to understand the logic and the thinking of this type of religious attitude, and then realize that the revolutionary aspect and the really extraordinary thing in this text about Isaac not sacrificed by his father is that suddenly an angel interrupts the whole thing and stops the sacrifice that was in that culture not something unusual. So we have to understand why sacrifice, which is a ritual repetition of the scapegoat mechanism in order to strengthen the peaceful side of the scapegoat mechanism. And so the people repeated that. I mean, we have this phenomenon of building sacrifices that we can discover all over the world, that in many cultures it was seen that if you build a big building or a dam or a bridge or other important building, you need a sacrifice in the foundation, because that will really prevent this building from breaking down and so on. And of course, we do not understand as modern people this attitude, but mimetic theory can help us to understand and then see why the biblical prophetical struggle against child sacrifice was such an important revolutionary thing. And in my book, the chapter on the Bible, I introduce with a very interesting quote by the German Nobel Prize winner and writer Thomas Mann, who was struggling with these issues over many, many years. First, there was a time in between the First and Second World War when scholars and people got attracted by new discoveries of mythology. So suddenly many people were attracted and thought it's very interesting, and these were lively cultures and so on. So he wrote a four-volume novel on Joseph and his brothers. And if you read the first novel, you have also again a lot of child sacrifices described, more than in the Bible. And he was fascinating by this age-old strange culture. But at the same time, you know, National Socialism was endangering the world more and more. And Thomas Mann had to flee to the United States. And in the later stage, so the later part of this novel is really a critique of, and also the later work of this mythological thinking. And in the 42, 43, I do not recall now the exact date, he gave a lecture in the Congress Library in Washington, where he describes a little bit his own work on the Joseph story, these novels, and how this relates to National Socialism. And he refers to this passage of Abraham and Isaac and said, the real revolution that happened in this text is that the son was spared and substituted by an animal. And this was a revolution, he said, a revolution how God tried to bring people out of the old pattern and move beyond human sacrifices. I think it's a tremendous insight, especially because he also related it to the struggle in the 20th century with National Socialism, where some of the elements of the early sacred now came again in a very dangerous modern form into politics and global affairs.
Yeah, absolutely. Talking about the sacrifice or the near sacrifice of Isaac and how God stops the child sacrifice from happening is also crucial in understanding Jesus and the sacrifice of Jesus. And one of the things that mimetic theory has been so helpful for me is helping me to unlearn a lot of popular theology, or a lot of the theology that says that God demanded the sacrifice of God's son and sacrifice Jesus up on the cross. Can you talk about Girard and mimetic theory and how mimetic theory helps us understand what's happening on the cross?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very interesting question, and also a question that has now led to many articles and book chapters, because it was so important for Girard to distinguish Jesus' death on the cross from the sacrifice coming out of the scapegoat mechanism typical of early religions. So he wanted to clearly separate those two things, so that in things hidden since the foundation of the world and even later, he avoided the term sacrifice for Jesus. And he emphasized all the passages in the New Testament where you can say this has nothing to do with sacrifice. But there are other passages in it where the term sacrifice is used. So it was the influence of the Innsbruck Jesuit theologian Raimund Schwager, who from the very beginning worked very closely with Schwager. So both of them used mimetic theory in regard to the Bible at the same time. So 1978, both published their books that used insights of mimetic theory to interpret the Bible. Girard, Things Hidden, and Schwager, Master Be Scapegoats. And they had a intense letter exchange where they discussed about these things. And Schwager, as a theologian, said we should not easily avoid the term sacrifice. And it was 1995 when I, with my colleague Josef Niewiadomski, published a Festschrift for Schwager. We invited Girard to contribute. And in this contribution, for the first time, he made very clearly a change of his position. He said we should not avoid the term sacrifice for the crucifixion, but should emphasize on the different meaning. So he still insists on the difference, but the danger of avoiding the term sacrifice in the case of Jesus is the danger to neglect the violence that was involved also in this case. And when I teach this topic to students, I always refer to the unofficial anti-Vietnam and peace movement hymn in the United States, John Lennon's Imagine. And this is a famous song with a lot of things to address and discuss in regard to theology. But for this topic now, for this question now, one line is very important. And this line says, nothing to kill or die for, nothing to kill or die for. And of course, when I teach these courses, I spend sometimes 30, 45 minutes with my students and let them listen to the song and let them read the text and say, what are all the elements and insights of Lennon you agree with? And they discover a lot, and it's justified. And of course, we all know a world in which nobody is forced to kill, or a world in which nobody is forced to die for something. I mean, like patriotism, nationalism, for religious communities, people were killed and people died by killing others. So to overcome those patterns is very important. But as long as we are in a world in which conflicts between human beings, violence emerges, there could be the critical, exceptional case, but significant case, that you can avoid killing others only by giving yourself your life. So by saying, I dream of a world where nothing to kill and die for, avoids the critical situation. What do you do in a situation where you have to choose between the two? And this choice, that there are circumstances where you have to give your life in order to save life, this is, I think, a very important element to understand Jesus' death on the cross, or to understand a life of a person like Martin Luther King or Mahatma Gandhi, or many other people who engaged in non-violence and struggled non-violently to overcome persecution, social injustice, and sometimes were killed by their fight against violence. And I would also understand Jesus' life and his teachings as a life and teaching of nonviolence. Mm. And when he was forced to choose between violence, I mean, there is this passage where he says himself, he could have probably, as being the Son of God, brought many violent elements in the world to overcome that, but that would contradict completely his message in the Sermon on the Mount. So he was killed as a consequence of his absolute engagement for a life of social justice and a life avoiding violence. And so the later Girard understood that to avoid the term sacrifice might be the problem that this one line in the song Imagine also causes in some way, that you are blind for those cases where you cannot avoid the one if you want to avoid the other. You cannot avoid dying if you really are committed to not killing. Mm. Maybe you are aware, there's a famous Austrian farmer who was married, had 3 children, and he resisted to fight for Hitler's army. And he was killed by the Nazis for resisting to do his military service. And it took a very long time until Austrian people agreed and saw him as a saintly man. Now he's not a saint, but what is the stage before sainthood in English? A blessed. So he's on the quite high up on the move to become a saint and recognized by the Catholic Church. But many people didn't understand that and said, how can he, as a father of young girls, let him be killed by the Nazis? But for him, the question was, and he was a very simple man, but with a deep spiritual insight when you read his letters and his notes, that he really understood better than many professors and highly sophisticated people what the whole Nazi ideology and policy was all about. And he said, if I want to be following the biblical message, I cannot become a soldier in Hitler's army. And the consequence was he had to die. And so therefore we should not avoid focusing also on these difficult questions, and that lead us to a better understanding of Jesus' sacrifice on the cross than all the traditional readings that saw him as a offer to God for cleaning God of human misconduct and failure and so on, which is a very strange theology that is much closer to the early religions and not to the biblical legacy.
I was just going to ask you about that, because the God that's so often depicted on the cross, who demands Jesus to sacrifice, is a God that's connected with wrath. Right. And so it's often said that, yes, God is love, but God is also wrath. Or God is love, but God is also judgment. And by judgment, the idea is God's going to be wrathful at you because God judges you as sinful and angry, unless God can channel all of that wrath against an innocent victim, Jesus. That sounds, as you were describing early religions and the double transference, exactly what the early religions were doing.
So you have the double-faced and ambiguous God of early religions, and not the father of Jesus, as Jesus describes him in his in his sermons and sayings. And
Yeah, and as the letter First John says, God is love, right? So
yeah,
God is
and in
light.
God, and God is light and no shadow in him. And if you compare it with the theology of Aeschylus, for instance, then you have again and again always this ambiguous, double-faced understanding of the divine being.
Yes.
That's the early religious projection coming from human beings.
Yes. One of the big debates in mimetic theory is, you alluded to it earlier, Girard's almost emphasis on the superiority of Christianity. But what role do you see other religions playing in either in mimetic theory or helping to illuminate us? I mean, you've talked about detachment quite a bit, which led me to think about Buddhism. So where do you see other religions in this conversation?
I mean, I had once a conversation with Shura on this issue, and I emphasized a little bit, if mimetic theory is a universal anthropology,
Mhm.
it would be, we couldn't understand why some of the important insights would not be observable in all the religions and cultures. So, I mean, of course, as a Christian, I'm myself a Christian, and Shura was a Christian converted later in his life. The message of Jesus, the Hebrew Bible, the New Testament, help us a lot to understand our own religion and our own world and our own life better. And I think this is very good. But this doesn't mean automatically that all other religious ways are wrong or that we can easily judge on that. And I myself started for a couple of years quite eagerly Islam, and I found a lot of parallels in Islamic writings and understandings. And of course, I would very strongly insist that the most important insights of the Judeo-Christian legacy, the overcoming of human sacrifice, the overcoming of early religions, the emphasis on social justice, the emphasis on the innocence of persecuted people, you find in the Quran as well as in the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. And we talked quite at length about Abraham not sacrificing his son. This key story is in the Quran. And whenever Girard tried to illustrate the difference of the Bible over against myth, he most of the time compared Oedipus myth with the Joseph story of the Hebrew Bible. And it's absolutely fascinating that the Joseph story is one of those biblical stories that has a huge presence also in the Quran. So if you would say the Joseph story is a keystone to understand this outside now the passion of Christ, what the biblical difference is, then you clearly see that that the Quran is part of this Abrahamic legacy. And I would even go a step further by looking at Eastern religions. And for the last couple of years, and I will do it next spring in a research group for 5 months, by focusing on Mahatma Gandhi.
Mm.
And I started already last couple of years Gandhi's work. And Gandhi was for me also a very helpful tool to approach Islam, because after 9/11, I felt, can I say something about terrorism, religion, violence, Islam, the whole discussion? I mean, I started Girard and all those things for more than 20 years. And now 9/11 happened. And in the first moment, I felt I cannot say anything or on not a lot. And then I started to read Gandhi, because Gandhi, of course, in this multi-religious Indian world, had a lot of contacts with Christians, with Muslims, and so on. So I read Gandhi, and it helped me a lot also to open my eyes for Islam. And by reading Gandhi, I felt especially a lot of parallels to Girardian insights in the city and the novel. So detachment, and the most famous thing that I would like to share now is a verse from the Isha Upanishads.
Mm.
So Gandhi, I mean, Gandhi was an eager reader of the Sermon on the Mount, and I just published a German article on that, showing that the way Protestants and Catholics today read the Sermon on the Mount is impossible without Gandhi, because early Christian, or for a very long time, with few exceptions like Francis of Assisi, they understood the Sermon on the Mount as a Christian passivity. But Gandhi emphasized very strongly the active role of Jesus, the active nonviolent engagement. And so when we today read the Sermon on the Mount the way most of the scholars read it, you see that there is Gandhi behind. So he was reading the Sermon on the Mount, he was reading the Quran, he was reading the biography of Muhammad. He was, every second week, he was reading the Bhagavad Gita. He read it in a very special way, but also was deeply convinced that also the Bhagavad Gita is a strengthening of his understanding of nonviolence. But for simple people who were not able to read, when he gave prayer meetings and little sermons or talks at prayer meetings, he only used a verse from the Isha Upanishad. And this is the first verse of the Isha Upanishad, and it goes like that: all this, whatsoever moves on earth, is to be hidden in the Lord. When thou hast surrendered all this, then thou mayest enjoy. Do not covet the wealth of any man. So if you read that very carefully, for me, this is a short version of the 10 Commandments. It's a short version of the 10 Commandments. And the 10 Commandments is a very helpful tool also to highlight mimetic theory, because the end of the 10th commandment says, do not covet the wife, the donkey, the slave. Everything what the other has is so attractive for all of us. Again, a deep anthropological insight. So the 10th commandment summarizes the most dangerous mimetic entanglements we can be caught up. And Girard powerfully explains that all the other commandments down to the commandment not to kill are in some way possible consequences if we do not keep the 10th commandment. But what's even more important, I mean, I developed it a little bit further, that I say the first commandment, it's again what I said in our first talk or the second talk about the summum bonum, about the highest good. You can only avoid the temptations addressed in the 10th commandment if you orient your desires towards those goods that do not devise us. So in the first 3 commandments, in the 10 commandments, is a strong emphasis to orient ourselves towards God. So to orient our desire towards God. And the more we fulfill this first table of the 10 commandments, the more likely it will be that we are able to keep the 10th commandment and do not fall in the dangerous corruptions and perversions and dangers of the other commandments. So if you read this verse of Gandhi, it says the same in some way. It says, give yourself completely over to God. This means then also detachment, but not in the sense you give up desire, but you orient your desire in a positive way. And then it says, when you do that, when you are in a detached mode, you can enjoy, because if you are not detached, you cannot enjoy anything. And it's also in the first letter to the Corinthians, you have the same use the world as if you don't use the world. Use your money or everything as if you have no money, or if you are not attached to any kind of money. And the last line, do not covet the wealth of any man, addresses, like the the 10th commandment, this danger of mimetic rivalry. So when I see this parallel, I am just struck that that there is a deep religious wisdom in all our religions that address exactly those key elements of mimetic theory. And we should not be surprised, because if mimetic theory is not just one theory, but really is a profound anthropology that addresses the basic questions we human beings face, it should be addressed in all the traditions of wisdom and spirituality and religion. And the more I worked in that direction, the more I found proof for that, which does not mean that I would now diminish all the differences between religion, or that I give up my Christian faith. It just, I mean, understanding that in Gandhi's work makes me confirms my understanding of the 10 commandments even stronger. I understand now the 10 commandments better than before I dealt with those insights of Mahatma Gandhi.
And I say thank God for that. Wherever truth shows up, thank God. Thank God that it's there.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right.
Wolfgang, thank you so much for these conversations and spending this time with us. It's been a joy for me, and it's always good to see you. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely.